Welcome to the Lotte City Hotel in South Korea, where I'm working this week. It is very different from Sydney last week, with tower blocks everywhere stretching out into the distance from my hotel room. When I look out there now, there's a bowing man statue just outside that I can see below. But this is a huge, great city if you've never been to Seoul before. So in this episode this week, I have just been out for dinner with a friend of mine who is a TV reporter here in Seoul. So I thought I would round up some of the points that came from that chat. Then I've got another really interesting chat with global CEO of Havas PR, James Wright, about being a cause-based business and how to have an opinion as an organization on political and social issues without alienating parts of your audience. Who's been doing that right and who's been doing it wrong? That's all coming up a little bit later in the episode. And by the way, thank you so much again. I know I say this often, but it just amazes me how this show has been growing. There's now, I think it's 3,080 odd followers on Spotify alone. That's completely ignoring Apple and all the other platforms, and it is growing every week. Despite this still being a hobby project, it is so exciting to be doing this and having all these conversations with you as well. Do keep reaching out. It is wonderful to hear from you about your campaigns and ideas. You can always reach me on LinkedIn at Richard Midson. That's M-I-D-S-O-N. M-I-D-S-O-N. I'll say it again during the show if you miss that there. Okay, so what was it, about 3 hours ago, I think it was, that I set off into the Jeonno-ho district of Seoul, South Korea, which is just a bit over the road from where I am right now, to go for a Korean barbecue with a friend of mine. Now, I have not got any tape of this chat, because he likes to keep the PR side of things low profile, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. But I wanted to give you some of my takeaways from the conversation that I had with him. So to give you a little bit of background, he's a freelance TV reporter and press agency reporter, and he does print as well. And he covers a lot of news for American TV networks as well and locally as well. He also does PR too. He also hosts events as well. He's actually going to be emceeing an event tomorrow for a German trade delegation, so he had to go off tonight when we finished dinner to go and finish his preparations for that. So he does I think it's about 60% journalism and about 40% PR. And there were a couple of really interesting points he made, which I think you can draw some good PR conclusions from this as well, frankly, from a whole marketing perspective too, on what he said. So the first one, he said that he is in a location where stories are in demand. Now, okay, well, not everyone is going to be in South Korea, but hear me out here. So in his particular case, he's saying that, look, North Korea in particular keeps giving him stories that allow him to be reaching out to networks and getting to do a lot of work. But there are also strong technology and trade stories going on in South Korea as well. There are events that are, for him, scaring or influencing the world, and that makes news. But it just shows that even in PR, if you can get your organization to be part of a conversation that is already being talked about, that is already happening, then journalists are going to, at times, frankly, just come to you. I actually asked him how he got started in South Korea as well, because when I worked with him like 20 odd years ago, we were in a newsroom in the United Kingdom. And he actually arrived in Korea initially on an English teaching visa. He came ready for tourism, but got asked by a US network to do something while he was here, to do a piece to camera. And as is the golden rule for all journalism, and frankly, I think in cases of a lot of PR, you always try to say yes to everything. Because he then did that. They were delighted by it, that newsroom. He went immediately in their books, and they came back to him again and again. And this is something that I often saw as well when I was working in newsrooms, that if you've got a PR who could provide you with some useful content, and they said yes that first time, whether they put a guest forward or whether they did something themselves, they went in your contacts book. You trusted them. You went back to them again and again. So it's the same lesson again. He was also able to capitalize on things as they happened. You know, I've talked about this before, the importance of timeliness in PR and in news and journalism. By being in the right place at the right time can sometimes help to make a dull story into something more interesting. In fact, I actually heard some military aircraft flying over the hotel a little bit earlier. And my friend also sent me some photos after I mentioned this to him of Chinooks. Because right now, as I'm here in South Korea, the US and South Korea are having the biggest military exercise in 6 years. So if I'd been in near a base or was watching something related to it, I might have been able to get on something myself. So timeliness can really help, as I say, to overcome a dull story too. So if your organization is developing or is part of one of these things, you know, we were talking about the disaster relief PR a while back. If you're involved in it, if you're on the ground, on the scene, even if you are a PR person, you may well be able to get some coverage simply by the fact that you are on location and you're doing something there right now. Another interesting point he raised was the way that journalists can get typecast. And this is an important thing actually to think about if you're pitching to a journalist or any kind of content creator for that matter. I made this mistake actually not that long ago when I pitched to a content creator an idea, and I hadn't done my research properly, as always the worst mistake you can do. And I asked if he would do something on a particular thing, and he pointed out to me very gently that that's not what he does. And when I looked at it, I could see in his profile that he actually said that he was avoiding this particular thing. But anyway, the point that my friend was making was that he's been very careful to make sure that he doesn't get typecast and that he's doing deliberately lots of different things. And he also keeps the PR side of what he's doing very low profile as well, so that it doesn't have any impact on what he's doing. I remember another example for myself as well, actually, when a radio station offered me a job presenting news on this particular station that was more focused on celebrity news than hard news. I think I've probably mentioned it before. And I wanted to make sure that I stayed in hard news. That was what I've always felt comfortable with, hard politics and hard news and human stories like this rather than celebrity stuff. And I could have very easily typecast myself as that celebrity reporter. So as always, it's really important if you're pitching to someone to make sure that you know what they want to cover and how they're approaching things. Another interesting point he brought up was about flexibility. Now, he's made a career from doing journalism, emceeing events, and PR. So the whole lot of them. So we were discussing this thing about, well, can you build this kind of portfolio career if you're involved in marketing? I'm not just talking about PR people, but marketing people as well. Can you build this stuff? Or at least should you try to be flexible to build up your credentials as a PR person, or even frankly as an agency if you're trying to pitch different sides of what you can deliver? So we were saying in the conversation, well, should PR people be thinking about becoming the spokespeople of organizations or doing personal social media and becoming an influencer literally in that space that you're putting stuff across? Not just organizational announcements, but things that you feel instead of just being the invisible PR marketing person. So is there a need for people to be more flexible? And two final quick points before I get on to that conversation with James Wright from Havas PR. And these were, the first one was that he said that being an English speaker coming from England actually helped to open doors for certain opportunities. By having something in common with some of the celebrities and high-profile figures who were coming to South Korea, he was often asked to go and interview them because the media outlets felt that he would be able to get more from them, because he would be able to relate to them better, because he lived in the same place where they'd been or went to the same school that they'd done. So those kinds of connections did have an impact. And as we know in PR, it's often better to send someone to try and work with someone that can relate to them because of their past history or past connection or some kind of similar shared experience, than it can be to get someone that has no understanding with them at all. And finally, AI and its effects on journalism. Apparently it's not really a conversation that is going on there at the moment. People aren't using AI yet, and it's not starting to take over things. But it is, of course, something that we're going to be monitoring constantly on this show. There was a robot that led me around Seoul Airport, which was absolutely fascinating. It has been fascinating being here as well. South Korea is a unique experience if you've never been before. We did actually go for karaoke last night, and I've not recorded any. And of course, they do have some absolutely amazing food as well. If you like kimchi, it is a delicacy here. It's a country that keeps on giving from a news point of view. By the way, if you would like more of my thoughts on that chat with him, which I haven't included in this episode, I will be putting those in the newsletter. You can get those by subscribing at the website at thepublicrelationspodcast.com, thepublicrelationspodcast.com. Okay, let's move on. Just over a week ago, I was at the Mumbrella ComsCon, as I'm sure you remember, in Sydney, Australia, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about quite a few times now. It was a really good event. I managed to chat with quite a few people there, and I'll be playing a lot of those over the coming weeks. Now, with all the controversy around companies getting involved in social issues, I was really interested to hear a presentation from James Wright. He's the leader of Red Havas Global PR Network and Havas PR Global Collective Agencies as well. So after hearing the presentation, I went and grabbed him. He was very tired. He'd just been on a 15-hour flight, but I sat down with him and asked him about a few of the points he made. And I would love to know as well, when you listen to this, if you've tried this sort of approach to social causes and had the similar sort of challenges that he faced. You can let me know privately on LinkedIn, Richard Midson, M-I-D-S-O-N. But I would love to get an idea about some of the things that you found with doing this. So the first thing I did with James was I wanted to challenge him on whether many companies are actually serious about social issues. And if they're not, if it really is just greenwashing, if it is virtual signaling, How do you convince them to be socially conscious if that's needed for the brand image? How do you do that? This is what I asked him.
Well, if they're all about their product and their service, then that's fine. But actually, I think you need to take a step back and actually say, what are we as an organization? What do we stand for? And if they've been pushing, values through the business, then you've also got to live those values in a real way, in the way in which you operate. So that's why I was saying in my presentation that, the concept of purpose has been pressure tested like never before. And so actually, I think those that really actually believe in their purpose, so CEOs and the C-suite that really believe in their purpose, double down on it. Whereas others, it was the first thing to go off the table. And I think, you found out a lot about organizations and leadership during that time. I think during the pandemic, this is where leaders actually had to demonstrate that they were worth the salaries that they're paid, because at that point, you really did have to lead from the front.
How do you change the mindset, though? Because, as I say, the problem with PR is that people are always going, look, we just want to put across a positive image of our company. We don't really necessarily even know what that means half the time. How do you persuade them to take this purpose-driven approach?
So when some of the big decisions came up during the pandemic or during the protest after George Floyd or the insurrection, I always ask a CEO a simple question. It's around the grandchild principle. In 10, 15, 20 years' time, whether you're a grandfather, grandmother, would you look in your grandchild's eyes and say, I made a great decision there and we did things the right way? And CEOs often, I think, take a step back and go, what decision do I need to make if my grandchild was the only stakeholder I was doing it for? And I think, there was a lot of very big businesses that made some very strong moves in that curve. They doubled down on what they were saying around their corporate purpose. But as I say, for others, if it was always just, painting the toilet door and not fixing the plumbing, it was never actually going to work
virtual
out.
signaling's always been a problem, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that was one of the points you made, was about actually doing. You used a great phrase. I can't remember what you exactly said, but you summed it up really well.
I don't know if it might have been like moving from pledges to progress, maybe, and moving from, storytelling to story doing. And so much of it has been around businesses that were very happy to talk about the pledges that we're making and the work they're doing in the community. And then suddenly the world changed. And then they were questioned as to whether did they really stand for these principles that they've talked about. I think consumers are quite savvy now, recognizing whether it's all marketing puff or whether it's actually reality that this organization does believe in us. I think it's fascinating now to see how organizations went through the pandemic and actually really helped and support their staff and actually to not make retrenchments. And then you come into like an economic downturn and suddenly do they then actually go back to the old ways, which because actually during economic downturns, businesses often will make retrenchments to cut costs.
Well, that's always the pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, what about the other aspect, which is that if you're putting across an opinion and you're taking a position, you will, by the very nature of it, alienate some people. How do companies, particularly big companies that have got a big, diverse audience, cope with that?
So what I was saying in the presentation was that you need to know your audiences really, really well. Like you see the thing with Nike and Colin Kaepernick. Anyway, so they knew what they were doing. Like, they knew their audience, and the people that were burning Nikes are not necessarily kind of people that necessarily going to have long-term buying to Nike. So knowing your audience is really important. I gave the example in the room. It's not just always about taking a position. We work for a very large retailer across the US, and following the Roe versus Wade decision, and suddenly over 50% of the people in America suddenly had their rights taken away, that it wasn't necessarily for that organization to come out in support of abortion or even for the decision, right? Even though actually the CEO wanted to come out and say, actually, I think this is disgraceful, and was really advocating that the organization should take a big stand. But I worked with their CMO to actually sort of educate him to think about all of the employee base that they have, who come from all parts of the political spectrum, and actually a lot of them are based in states actually that were leaning towards supporting the decision, to actually, instead of taking a position, to actually be more proactive around educating their staff across all of America and different states on the issue of abortion, so they can learn.
This was sort of a softer approach. But what about when you do get that position where in America, we're talking about Republicans and Democrats that are becoming more and more divided. So if you've got a product that appeals to both, you can't say one opinion and appeal to both. So what do you do?
Well, I think you've got to reach back and say, actually, what is it that we have said that we are? Like, who are we in the fabric of our organisation?
But you may well end up, though, with just customers on one side.
But you go in with it eyes wide open. But for a lot of organisations, there might not be necessarily a lot of skin in the game for doing that. if you're in sort of a utility product, it becomes less of an issue. But if your
People have
product
to use
lives
it
on
anyway.
personality,
Yeah.
then maybe that's more of a piece to take. And you look at what's happened with Budweiser right now with the transgender rights. It's fascinating that their primary audience across Budweiser is, of course, Middle America, and it's the biggest selling beer in America. But then they're trying to essentially grow their pie by adding a new audience. So transgender and the lesbian and gay community more broadly, bring them into the brand. But then they've ended up actually alienating the very people that they were looking to bring into the brand because they didn't really understand how this campaign was going to be reacted to by their core audience. You don't want to alienate your core audience at the risk of just essentially what is it's a niche audience that they were going for. I mean, I don't disagree with what they were trying to do. They just went about it the wrong way.
Because you've always got to look as well at who are the key people who are trying to reach. I mean, I think about Balenciaga, okay, and the whole controversy over that is how much impact did it actually have on the brand, on the core audience, compared to the media that got all excited and all annoyed about it, how much impact that actually had.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, like with Budweiser and Bud Light, eventually their sales, I'm sure, will return to where they were. It took, and their share price took a dip for a little while, and it's sort of like started to come back now. But the idea of building the pie with that community now is now almost off the table, at least for a significant amount of time for them. And of course, it's a very competitive market that they operate in. So making those little trips and falls means that for a period of months now, they're going to have to, put a lot of time and effort into dealing with the issue. And on the other side, obviously, they've lost some sales.
Just one final thing. If we're talking about smaller businesses, how can they approach this kind of thing? Because they're not going to get their word out there as easily as like some of the big firms, some of the big corporations. So how can a small-sized business, say 30 people or something like that, get involved in this kind of thing of being purpose-driven?
Well, I think that's where the opportunity is for them. I mean, you look at someone like Ben & Jerry's, that started off as a very small ice cream company in Vermont. It's a client of ours. It started off as a small piece, but they said, we're a social issues company that also makes ice cream. And they used it as an opportunity then to build what is now a global brand that was sold to Unilever. So I think for small businesses, it's actually a point of difference, right? As long as it's authentic and real, right? It has to live in the organization and be believed by everybody that's in it.
So, have you had any success with doing similar stuff to what James was saying there? Have you faced that problem of trying to decide what position your organization should take when it could alienate part of your market? I would love to know. You can tell me privately on LinkedIn, Richard Midson, Midson, Midson. As always, the notes from this episode are going to be in the newsletter next week. You can find that at thepublicrelationspodcast.com. If you have emailed me, once again, I must apologize. I know I say this a lot. This whole podcast remains a passion project. I have a full-time job as well. I will get back to you, even if it takes a little while. So my apologies if you've had to wait, but there's only so many hours in the day. I will get back to you, though. That is it for this week. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you are having an absolutely wonderful week, and I will have loads more from the world of PR and PR-led marketing campaigns next week on the Public Relations Podcast. Have an awesome one.